Churchill and the World at War by Thomas Winkelmann. The Churchill Family. Winston Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace on November 30, 1874. At that time, horse-drawn carriages filled London streets, and inventions such as electric lights, automobiles, and flying machines existed only in the minds of scientists. Queen Victoria ruled Britain. The Royal Navy controlled the world's oceans. By 1874, Britain led the world in both wealth and power. At the top of British society lived such people as Churchill's parents, Randolph and Jeanette Churchill. Jeanette Jerome Churchill grew up in the United States in a wealthy New York family. When she was a teenager, her mother took her and her sisters to France. There they went to school and met people at the top of European society. In 1874, Jeanette married Randolph Churchill. Randolph Churchill studied law and history at Oxford University, then served in Parliament, Britain's legislative branch. He held other public offices, including Chancellor of the Exchequer, or Secretary of the Treasury. His son Winston would one day hold the same office. Valuable lessons. Like many people of their social class, Randolph and Jeanette Churchill sent their son to boarding school. From the time Churchill was 7 years old, he lived at school. He only went home for holidays and occasional weekend visits. He felt lonely at school and often wrote to his parents asking them to visit. However, they rarely came to see him. At first, Churchill went to St. George's School in Ascot. He had trouble adjusting to the many rules. Mrs. Everest, his nanny, arranged to have him transferred to a school in Brighton, which was closer to home. Although Churchill and Mrs. Everest got to see one another more frequently, he still rarely saw his parents. Churchill next went to Harrow, near London. Although he disliked team sports, he did well at swimming and fencing. He began writing for the school newspaper and started to read more. Churchill discovered he had a love of history. He studied famous battles and learned valuable lessons about decisions made by leaders of the past. Churchill would remember these lessons decades later as Britain's Prime Minister and wartime leader. Military training and service. Churchill's father, like many people of his social class, believed in public service. He thought that young men should study religion, law, or military science. His son seemed destined for a career as a military officer. Churchill's boyhood interests and talents made him a natural fit for the army. In the fall of 1893, Churchill became an officer cadet, or officer in training, at Sandhurst, Britain's Royal Military Academy. As a cadet, he learned military history, geography, tactics, and strategy. By graduation, Churchill had risen to 20th in his class of 130 officer cadets. This allowed him to join the cavalry regiment of his choice, the 4th Hussars. The months following his graduation were difficult. Both his father and his former nanny, Mrs. Everest, died. His mother remarried. At the age of 21, Churchill found himself alone in the world. Churchill then sailed to Cuba as a war reporter for a London newspaper. The Cubans were fighting for independence from Spain. Churchill learned about independence movements and the effect they had on civilians. After World War II, Churchill would remember these lessons when Britain began giving independence to its colonies. Churchill returned to England in time to go to India and Afghanistan with his regiment. On his return from India, Churchill wrote a book called The Story of the Malakand Field Force. In it, he described the horrors of battle. He also admitted that war could be exciting. He wrote, "I found that there is nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result." Churchill's early career. In 1899, Churchill left the military to run for Parliament. He lost the election, but not his drive to succeed. He traveled to South Africa to report on the Boer War, in which Dutch farmers, called Boers, fought to maintain independence from Britain. By witnessing so many conflicts, Churchill learned the strategies used by guerrillas and commandos, or small groups of soldiers who move quickly and conduct surprise attacks. He realized that these groups could create a great number of casualties against a large military force. During World War II, he would remember this lesson. Under his wartime leadership, the British Army formed such groups. The British helped train and equip resistance fighters or freedom fighters in countries occupied by the Germans. After the war, British commandos set an example for other countries to follow. After his time in Africa, Churchill finally won a seat in Parliament. In 1908, he married Clementine Hosier. He called his proposal to her the greatest speech he ever made. During this time, he also learned to fly an airplane. Europe had mostly been at peace since the end of the war that France and Germany fought in 1870 to 1871. That war had established Germany as a major military power. Churchill spent a great deal of time thinking about the threat of a major European war. He knew that once mobilization took place, the British Army could be built up very quickly. He believed it would take far longer to modernize Britain's navy. Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, which gave him the chance to improve his country's navy. In that same year, France and Germany nearly went to war with each other when a German warship entered Agadir, a French-controlled port in Morocco. This was known as the Agadir Crisis, or the Second Moroccan Crisis. As France's ally, Britain would have to take that country's side when war did come. Churchill and the Great War. World War I began after a long period during which feelings of nationalism grew in Europe. People wanted to live with others who shared their language and culture. Some countries wanted to continue building colonial empires or struggled to control collapsing empires. A member of a Serbian group that opposed the Austro-Hungarian Empire assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife on June 28, 1914. Austria declared war on Serbia in response to the killings. Russia, Serbia's ally, declared war on Austria as a result. Germany, Austria's ally, in turn declared war on Russia and her ally France. Britain fought out of loyalty to France and because German troops had invaded Belgium on their way into France. The Great War had begun. As the German army raced towards Paris in August 1914, British troops crossed the English Channel to aid France. British assistance played an important role in halting the German advance. As the days turned into weeks, the opposing armies dug trenches. By November 1914, systems of trenches stretched from the Belgian coast all the way to Switzerland. The troops had a new type of war forced upon them: trench warfare. In 1915, Churchill helped plan the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. Turkey was an ally of Germany and Austria. At Gallipoli, however, the British had no trenches in which to hide. The British and their allies suffered more than 200,000 casualties before returning home in defeat. News of the loss caused Winston Churchill to resign as First Lord of the Admiralty. He rejoined the army and went to France. By then, the Great War had become a war of attrition, or a war of steady losses through constant fighting. Despite the heavy casualties, the front lines in France and Belgium did not move very much. Germany's use of submarines and the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania helped bring the United States into the war in 1917. In addition to this new threat, the Germans faced a crumbling economy, food shortages, and political instability. They could fight no longer. November 11, 1918, was named Armistice Day, because Germany finally surrendered. Later, on June 28, 1919, a formal peace treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Churchill and World War II. After 1918, the British people did not want to think about war anymore. Churchill still saw danger in the world and could not ignore it. He was concerned about the new communist government in Russia. Churchill worried that communism would spread outside of Russia. He also worried about Germany. The Germans had been forced to pay reparations after the war. Their economy suffered, and their country became unstable, making them wish for a strong leader who could improve their lives. The choice of the German people was Adolf Hitler and his party, the Nazis. Hitler began to rebuild Germany's military soon after he came to power, even though the Treaty of Versailles did not permit this. Hitler then sent troops into the Rhineland, an area where no German troops were allowed. Churchill knew that war would come again, but the British people, including Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, could think only of peace. The Prime Minister would not listen to Churchill, who was then merely a member of Parliament. Chamberlain wanted to follow a policy of appeasement. In order to avoid war, Chamberlain would allow Hitler to do what he wished. In 1938, Chamberlain let Hitler annex Austria. Later that year, Chamberlain signed the Munich Pact, giving Hitler part of Czechoslovakia. As Churchill knew, appeasement would not prevent war. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, after agreeing with Stalin to divide the country between Germany and the Soviet Union. Initially, Churchill was given his old job back as First Lord of the Admiralty. Then, on May 10, 1940, Chamberlain resigned, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. After failing to defeat the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. The German army began pouring into the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Britain still needed help to fight against Hitler. President Roosevelt wanted to help the British, but the American people did not want to go to war. The United States was still neutral. Roosevelt formed a program called Lend-Lease. It allowed him to send supplies but not troops to the British and the Soviets. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, however, the United States entered the war. Hitler declared war against the United States on December 11. Finally, Britain would have the help that it needed. Throughout the war, Churchill talked with Stalin and Roosevelt. Together, they planned their strategies. They also discussed what to do after the war. Churchill feared that the Communists would try to create an empire. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union was especially costly. More than 20 million Russians were killed in the war. Nevertheless, the Russian army won a series of major victories against the Germans. The losses against the Soviets greatly weakened the German army. As a result, less than 1 year after Allied forces invaded Normandy, the Germans were defeated. The Soviet Union then began to take control of Eastern and Central Europe, just as Churchill had predicted. After the war ended, people wanted to forget about the war, yet Churchill again worried about the future. At Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he spoke in 1946 of the Iron Curtain that had fallen across Europe. He meant that the territory from East Germany to the Soviet Union was now controlled by the Soviets. In each country they controlled, the Soviets put an oppressive regime in place. As a member of Parliament, Churchill worked to expand the role of the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Churchill knew that the world needed protection from communism and other threats. The greatest man in the world. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II, The sixth British ruler during Churchill's lifetime made Churchill a knight. Sir Winston Churchill won the Nobel Prize that same year. Many people thought that he should have been awarded the prize for peace because of his role in winning World War II. However, the Nobel Committee awarded him the prize for literature. By then, Churchill had written 40 books. Churchill's first term as Prime Minister ended in 1945. He again served as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. In 1955, Churchill finally retired from the office of Prime Minister, yet he still continued to serve in Parliament. For the next 9 years, Churchill spent time with his family, traveled, wrote, and painted. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy awarded him with an honorary United States citizenship. Churchill retired from Parliament in 1964. That same year, a girl in Mexico City sent a card to Churchill in honor of his 90th birthday. She did not know his address, so she wrote, "The greatest man in the world," on the envelope. Churchill received the card. Winston Churchill died on January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years after his father's death. He is remembered for his words and deeds as the man who would never surrender.